this video is part of the time capsule project of the International Association of Hydrogeologists. And today our guests are Professor Ghislain de Marsily from Paris 6 in France and many other institutions. Dr. John Doherty from Australia and Dr. Philippe Brunner, who is here in Neuchâtel, and myself, Philippe Renard. So the main topic of the discussion today is on groundwater modeling, and especially the integration of field observations, state variables, into groundwater models, and how can we do that to extract relevant information to better understand the system. And one of the key technique to do that is the pilot point method, and we will maybe start the discussion with the basic history of the pilot point method. So maybe Ghislain, you can start by explaining us how you started to have this idea of the pilot point method, how it came, and how then it was developed and used in PEST by John.
Okay, thank you, Philippe, for organizing this interview. I'm very glad to have John Doherty to discuss with, and you, well, if I can make a little bit of history of how I became interested in inverse problems, that goes back to 1967, when I started hydrogeology as a young researcher. At that time I was still young. The young researcher at the Paris School of Mines, and the first thing we did was to look at a modeling study done previously in the Rhine aquifer, the Rhine Valley aquifer, and the modeling was still an analog, electric analog study. And this was the cuve réoélectrique in French, which is a sort of a water tank through which electricity was representing water flow, and the transmissivity is given by the thickness of the water layer. So with impervious clay, or no, not clay, plasticine, some kind of plastic, you could model the shape of the bottom of the water tank, and that model would give the transmissivity. So you could add a little bit of plasticine here or subtract, and then you would change the transmissivity, and you could measure the flow of the electricity. So that was nice. You had hands-on methods to, make the shape of the transmissivity in the aquifer with your actual finger. I didn't do that. It was done by colleagues in Strasbourg. Anyway, we had that model, and we were asked, can you develop a numerical model that can represent the same thing, flow in steady state in the aquifer, by changing the value of transmissivity in the meshes of your model. So I started developing a direct flow model, finite difference, very simple things, and we introduced the thickness that they had hand-made, hand-determined by their manual inverse, if I can say so. It's more than trial and error, it's manual. And of course we did obtain more or less the same result that they had obtained in terms of good fit or poor fit with the observations. And then the next question we ask ourselves, this was my colleague Yves Selem, with whom I was working in that group. We were actually the only two in that group. There was a small group at that time. We said, well, if we know the distribution of the head, can we back up what is the shape of the water tank or the value of the transmissivity? So we started very hard, without much success, I would say, in trying to solve the inverse problem. At that time, that was 67, the only work that had been published so far was mostly using the Cauchy method, which is to say you draw the flow tubes, and if you know the transmissivity along a flow tube, then you can determine the value of the transmissivity along the flow tube. So we played that a little bit. We tried to make that more automatic. And we ask ourselves the questions, yes, but within two successive flow tubes, the solution is totally independent. You can have a high transmissivity here and a low transmissivity there in the two different flow tubes. Of course, it will be consistent along the flow tube, but across the flow tube, you can do anything. So the Cauchy method by itself does not tell you anything about, the spatial distribution, at least across the flow tubes. So we never published anything on that because we hadn't found any solution. But that gave us, and when I mean us, this Yves Messelen and myself. Yves Messelen was the quote-unquote the good mathematician in the team, and I was doing the programming and that kind of thing. And we realized that in the inverse, one way or another, you had to impose some kind of consistency of the value of the transmissivity across the flow tubes, which the hydraulics could not give you, because the hydraulics only gives you continuity and consistency in the direction of the flow tube, not across them. So we had to introduce some kind of overarching procedure that would make things consistent in the other direction, orthogonal to the flow tubes.
So that was the base of regularization, right?
Yes. So it's essentially a regularization. So the idea we developed at that time, and which was published in Water Resources Research in 1971, was a regularization idea, and it was a sort of a progressive approach to the inverse problem. And the question could be framed that way. Let us assume that I want to represent the transmissivity in my aquifer by one single value. What would be the optimal value to represent that aquifer? So we wrote equations and minimized the square of the head differences between calculated and observed. And with that simple norm and writing a very simple equation, you find out what is the single value of transmissivity that could fit the model. And then we said, well, maybe one value is not enough. Let's have 4 values. We'll have described the aquifer with 4 values. But we divided the aquifer into 4 quadrangles, 4 parts of similar size. So we would take a square and then divide it into 4, and it would have 4 values. But we said, in a way, the initial transmissivity, which is the average or some kind of an average of the 4 values that we have determined first, should still be there. So we are going to have deviation from this initial homogeneous value by having pluses here, minuses here, and all these should balance, therefore, that the initial mean would be still the same. So, and the algorithm would go on. So we get 4 values, and then we get 16, and so on and so forth. And you could multiply until you get to a smaller mesh where you stop. And of course, what you find is that if you do that, and you have many, at each step you have more unknowns, you end up, the system blows up. In other words, you have very large differences between closed blocks because the system is unstable when you have too many unknowns. Whereas it was stable when you had few unknowns because you were, in a way, homogenizing things. So with MSLM, we said we need a regularization term, and we used some kind of a Tikhonov way to normalize and minimize the objective function was changed by adding this Tikhonov term in order to regularize the system. And that was it. That was what was published in 1971. So this is not the pilot point yet. But we are coming to it.
So what you're doing now is a kind of subspace method, sort of a rudimentary singular value decomposition, yes, by subdividing progressively, yes, until you realized if there was no integrity in subdividing anymore, yes, which is similar to what subspace methods do today, yes, on a more formal basis.
Yes, yes, we said, come on, we stop the algorithm when we see that we introduce too much, noise and instabilities in the system. So, and I mean, for a while we didn't do much. Having published that paper, we're very glad. Water Resources Research. I mean, it was my first paper, so I was very proud. But at the same time, our group in Fontainebleau, in the School of Mines, was working with Georges Matron, who developed geostatistics and Quijing and all that. And we learned about what they were doing. And I mean, this idea of having squares and subsquares and so on doesn't give a lot of attention to the actual distribution in space of the property of the medium, what is governed by geology. These squares had nothing to do with geological knowledge. It was totally arbitrary. So slowly and slowly, the idea developed that if we want to understand the way transmissivity or permeability changes in space, you should have an understanding of how this property is, varying in space, and one tool to do that is geostatistics. And you've built the variogram, and that variogram is based only on measurements, and it gives you an idea of the spatial correlation, the structure in space of that parameter. So when did the idea come that we should put the two together, the inverse and the geostat, by developing the pilot point? I think it was through a discussion with colleagues at the French Institute of Petroleum, where I believe I was making a presentation of geostat and geoviograms and things like that. And one of the guys who was there, his name is Dupuis. He passed over long ago now. And he had published a paper on inverse, which is called Dupuis, Chavant and Lemonnier in the journal of SPE journal. That was in the mid-70s, and that was a paper where Chavant and them presented the adjoint state method to calculate the gradient of the objective function. And somehow in discussing with this guy, he had the idea that maybe the geostat could be, formulated in terms of pilot point. And the name pilot point was invented by him, not by me. Dupuis, his name was. Maybe it didn't do him a lot of well, because he died very few years after that. Anyway, that came the concept of having additional points used in the Kriging equation, but instead of having points where you know the value, you said, well, these are my unknowns. And I combine the known values with the unknown values, and then you develop the pilot point arguments. And then you have all kinds of sensitivities. You can put as many points as you want. You can locate them where you want. You can impose bounds on them. So
the initial idea was to have one single pilot point at a time, or already to have a set?
Always have
a set.
Have a few. My first idea was, well, if I have 20 measurement points, it doesn't make sense to have 100 additional pilot points. I should keep that. There's no real mathematical argument to say that, but intuitively I would say maybe I can add another 20 or 30, but not thousands or hundreds. In which I believe I may have been wrong, and I think that Jaime Gomez Hernandez, who developed something similar to the pilot point, which is called the master locations in his terminology, he said, forget about the number, that's not the issue. You can have as many as you wish, as you need, and this will give you a good answer anyway. So maybe I was wrong. Anyway, I was using a small number of pilot points and locating them one by one, adding a few here, a few there. And my criterion for adding pilot points was when I was unable at some location in the aquifer to fit the observed heads. It means that there was something happening in the transmissivity that could not be represented with the existing number or location of the pilot point. So I would add pilot points at the location where I could not see the model fit the heads, the observed heads. And that is where I more or less stopped. I published that probably poorly, at least in today's requirements for an academic. This was done in the 70s, mid-70s, because it was part of my doctorate thesis, which was presented in 78. And I think the first paper was in 86 with Fasanino in an SPE journal. And then next one was another PhD from Catherine Certes, published in 91 in Advances in Water Resources. So it was a slow evolution, all the concept which I... So if it were for me, I think the work on the pilot point would have stopped there, then. But thanks to John, it did not stop there.
Well, it wasn't just me, as we've talked about. Our colleagues, Marshall Avenue, did a lot of work on pilot points as well. But I'm interested to hear that from the moment you first started using them, you were using them in a highly parameterized sense in conjunction with regularization devices. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. Well, the regularization approach was for the first approach, the square that you subdivide. In the pilot point, I didn't add initially the regularization term, this Tikhonov norm that you would add to the sum of the squares of the head differences, because I think my idea was getting back to my first approach where you divide it in square. The regularization was to impose, some kind of stability, continuity, and not instabilities. And by virtue of the principle of geostat, I thought the regularity and the consistency in space was included in the formulation through the Kriging equations. So I didn't add regulation at that time. It's been done later, but I didn't do it.
Yes, I'm a little bit of the school of Gamet, that the more pilot points that you use, the better. But only, of course, in conjunction with regularization. I feel that it's not having to make the decision of where the pilot point needs to be and allow the mathematics to make the decision for you as to where it lets the heterogeneity arise, but using regularization appropriately to let it rise only as much and only where it needs to arise in response to the information content of the data seems to me to be the best way to get most information out of that data. But I do agree with you that it is possible to get a little bit perhaps obsessed with getting a good fit. And my goodness, the more pilot points you have, the better the fit you can get. And while that may give instant gratification, it may not produce the best model. So I think that the use of highly parameterized inversion and pilot points is a good device, because that, especially if you're computing derivatives using finite differences, ideally you'd like every cell in the grid to be a parameter, but you can't. And I didn't want to go to the point of using zones because they're artificial, so pilot points was just that nice place where I could have the best of both worlds or the best compromise. But I wouldn't dream of using them without regularization to keep the inversion problem honest in getting the most out of data and not allowing me to wander into fairyland where the pursuit of the good fit becomes everything.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Now, the idea of optimal location or selection of the optimal points for positioning the point points is actually from Marsh-Lavenue. And I didn't know him when he did his first approach to the inverse problem. He had probably read the theory in one of the papers, and he applied that to the modeling of the Culebra aquifer in New Mexico for the WIPP site, the waste isolation pilot plant, which was being developed by Sandia National Laboratories for the Department of Energy in the US. And he had started to locate pilot points to the inverse manually, and then he realized that there would be better ways to do it, and that to let, as you said, the data tell you where is the most sensitive points, where you would minimize your head differences by having one additional location for the pilot points. So he did that, and I think he did it mostly empirically. I would say he would add a point, see the sensitivity, and then displace the point and so on, and eventually select the final location by a trial and error type of thing. And then we met at the request of Sandia National Laboratories, because by doing that and modeling the WIPP site, Marsh had been obliged by the methodology, the pilot point, to add points in the aquifer and get a very large transmissivity, whereas all the measurement points in that aquifer were low values. So everybody at Sandia would say, come on, I mean, we know that from this aquifer that there's no need, there's no measurements of a high transmissivity anywhere. Why is this bloody technique coming from France telling us that there is high transmissivity here south of the site? And furthermore, having this high transmissivity at that location would drive nuclides, if they escape from the site, to the outer boundaries of the site in no time. So it was really, very annoying and very disturbing, because it could or not make the difference whether the site was acceptable for storing it or not. All that on one pilot point, which was optimally located by Marsh-Lavenue and gave quote unquote, wrong results, at least unpleasant results. So what do you do with that? So Sandia, for reasons which I never understood, refused to have a well drilled there. I guess the reason was that the site in question was outside the legal limit of the WIPP site. The WIPP site, there is an act in Congress which said this square is no longer part of New Mexico, it belongs to the government, to the federal government, and in that square the US DOE could do anything they wanted. But outside that limit, then they were in New Mexico again. And I think this is an issue. They could not, recommend to drill a well there and see whether the transmittivity was high or low. Now, just to make, long story short, I understood from Marshall Avenue, actually in November last year, at the seminar which you organized with Matt
Tonkin.
Matt Tonkin and on Marshall Avenue on PEST, that indeed a well has been drilled, I think a couple of years ago only, in that location, and indeed the transmittivity is high. So it took 20 years to confirm that. But at the time, Marsh was interested in the inverse, he had done that, I was interested in the inverse. Sandia formed what was called the geostatistical working group to look at this problem, find out whether one could have alternative, different scenarios of distribution of transmissivity that could fit the data, see what the uncertainty rate was on that parameter that was interesting to them. It is the travel time for nuclides released into the aquifer at one location to reach the boundary, which was the permit criterion. So we set up this group, and with Marsh we worked a lot on comparison of different inverse, on artificial data on this real site. And eventually Marsh did his PhD with me at the Paris School of Mines and presented an extension of the pilot point method where he made the selection of the optimal location automatic, and all kinds of regularization terms and bells and whistles, if I can say, to make it work for the WIPP site.
Well, calibrating a model is just like geophysical data interpretation, really, isn't it? It's just environmental data interpretation. And I often find the same thing too, that people get a little surprised when the inversion process turns up things which they don't expect. So they expect model calibration to perhaps allow their parameters to tweak a little bit to confirm pretty much their preconceptions. But if it actually does data interpretation as it should, their first reaction is to condemn the method because it's telling them something that they didn't know. And after all, good data interpretation should tell you something that you didn't already know.
Yes, exactly. And I think the Sandia colleagues, this Mel Marietta, Wip Anderson, and others at the group, were very wise because they never rejected the method, even if the first reaction was it's wrong. But they accepted that it is valid results from modeling, and you may not just reject that, and you have to take that into account and do whatever additional certification, confirmation, whatever you want, to use it. But they didn't just say, well, I don't like it, I don't want it.
Have you found other occasions too where the industry's been a little bit loath to accept inverse methods? In my own experience, especially in the early days, inverse methods were treated with suspicion. Only if you calibrated a model by hand, it was thought, could you bring your full range of expert knowledge to the data interpretation process, which is model calibration. But gradually it's being accepted, still not ubiquitously, but I think it's got currency now. But have you found a lot of resistance to using computer-based methods for calibration of groundwater models?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this pilot point, I just told you, I developed in the mid-70s. I don't think there's any one organism in France who is using it, not one single. And even my colleagues at École des Mines, at School of Mines, just prefer doing, hand.
Still by
Yes,
hand?
Yes, yes.
And if they calibrate by hand, how do they do uncertainty analysis?
Probably they don't. Probably they don't.
And has anyone explained to them that there may be some uncertainty associated with predictions made by models?
I would say in the water community, they think they can do away without it. And why didn't they like the inverse problem? Because you have to, you get the headache to try to understand what is the underlying theory. Whereas you can understand finite differences even if you're not very smart. That's easy to understand. Now if you go to inverse and to adjoint state and you go to Tikhonov with regularization, what's that? You want me to use that? Ooh. The people becomes to be cautious. They say, well, I can fit a model with trial and error. Why would I trust these mathematical methods? So the hydrogeology community, in France at least, is not very mathematically, interested. So they think they can do well with the hand calibration, trial and error. And you're right that the additional benefit of doing calibration using an inverse is that you can do sensitivity analysis and develop a set of alternative solutions that equally fit the norm and gives you sort of an order of magnitude of uncertainty. But that has never been high on the agenda of the requirements for models.
Even in areas where modelling is done for reasons of risk assessment, where the cost of something going wrong, for example, waste repository, where the cost of something going wrong is very high, wouldn't risk assessment, uncertainty assessment almost be mandatory in such a context?
Yes, absolutely. However, again, in the French context, the waste disposal issue, which has been with us for, I started working with that in 1973, even before doing the inverse, has been a very strong argument on type of rocks. Shall we use fractured rocks like granite, or shall we use salt, or shall we use clay? And personally, I've been advocating to use clay for reasons we could discuss. And that discussion, whether it is that type of rock or that type of rock, has overwhelmed any other, more detailed appreciation of the thing. And we would do theoretical safety calculations taking arbitrary numbers from the literature on the value of the geology because we didn't have a site. Whereas the US had sites. In France, we didn't have a site. And that eventually ended up in the decision taken in probably in 96 or 97, I forgot exactly when the French government had decided that nuclear waste disposal would have to consider at least 3 sites, and there were one in the granite of the Vienne department, another in the clay site in the Gard department, and the third in the clay again in the Meuse-Haute-Marne site in France. And all the research in waste disposal was comparing the merits of these things, and not even preliminary data were able to think of fitting an inverse. So it's only, I would say, starting from 2006 that enough data, well, one site was selected, granite was forgotten, and all the eggs were put in the baskets of clay. And I would say that I pushed a lot for that decision to occur. I happened to be in a commission which is called the Commission Nationale d'Évaluation, which was advising the government on what option to take. Every year and after year we were publishing reports to supervise what the agency in charge of waste disposal was doing, and we were saying we should do that, we should not do this, we should do that. And in that commission, the 12 of us decided that granite was not the rock to look at. So, what you just mentioned, the need for nuclear waste sensitivity study or alternatives is just becoming, these days, since the 2000 and 2005, 6, an issue which Andra is considering. And so they are trying to do things along the vein of an inverse. But we lacked, by comparison with WIPP, the site and the idea and the interest and the data to do that kind of early analysis because we didn't have sites. In other areas of hydrogeology, which is more water resources management, the argument is perhaps less strong because you can have alternative fitting, but I don't think the sensitivity is that great in terms of amount of water that you can pump out. What is really important is transport. When you have different velocity fields, different type of pathways where a source point can go to the outlet. So I think the need for alternative scenario is more into waste disposal. It will be nowadays or in the coming years very much so for CO2 sequestration, because when we inject CO2 in an aquifer and we don't know the heterogeneity, we discussed that over lunch, then you take risk because you don't know where the supercritical CO2 is going to flow. So you need that type of uncertainty. But at a smaller scale, for instance, if you have a polluted site, industrial site, where you have solvents or solutes of some kind or another, if the uncertainty is so great, and since these sites are not very deep, the industry or even the administration will require additional wells and not so much be interested. I've never seen, at least in France, stochastic simulation done for solving site contamination problems due to industrial release of waste in the aquifer.
Uncertainty analysis, though, has a lot of good byproducts, like if you can quantify uncertainty, you can quantify the ability for different types of data to reduce uncertainty. And if a lot of money is going to be expended in acquiring extra data, ideally that should be preceded by an analysis of how efficacious that data is going to be in reducing uncertainty, which is predicated on the assumption you know how to quantify uncertainty. And I think that, in modelling in general, people have an opinion that, once it's modelled, we know the answer. When in fact, really all a model can do, and I think it should be shouted from the rooftops, is encapsulate what you know, and really what you know can only be expressed stochastically because we only know things probabilistically. And a model can only encapsulate what you know and quantify what you don't. And it's what you don't know that's probably the most important element of sound decision making. And that's obvious in most other places, but when we come to make decisions in the environmental industry, we don't tend to think like that. And part of it's been because I think models have been a little bit oversold, possibly because of the fact that people have been paid a lot of money to produce crystal balls, or possibly because people don't want to think that we still don't know as much as we'd like to know in order to make a decision. But I think until we embrace the fact that models' chief role in the decision-making process is to quantify what we don't know, we're still not going to get environmental decision-making right.
I wouldn't argue with you. On the contrary, I totally support what you said. I was just telling you what I have observed in my country.
It's a similar story all over the world, I'm sure.
But I'd like you to tell us a little bit about why you selected the pilot point method in the beautiful code PEST, which you have developed.
Well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
And how you succeeded in making it used elsewhere, and how you succeeded to make it sort of a uniform or universal tool for solving the inverse problem.
Well, I think it's a sad fact of our industry, or most industries, that in terms of getting it used, nothing really exists unless you can click on it in a piece of software. So I was lucky. I wrote PEST, and then PEST wasn't actually very popular until I said, if I'm going to make PEST popular, I've got to write a set of utilities to link it to popular groundwater models. And so I linked it to ModFlow, and PEST became a little more popular. And then graphical user interfaces started to pick it up, and all of a sudden it was on the front page. So,
And maybe also a big decision was to make it publicly available for free, open source, and I mean, you have not tried to sell it.
well, I used to be able to sell it, and this is a major issue, an issue perhaps we haven't got time to talk about here, but one has to ask. Yes, PEST is public domain. I used to be able to sell it for $600 a copy and thereby earned about $30,000 a year, which paid for its development and support. And when you write software, and if it has new ideas, you have to write the software, you have to write the documentation, you have to write the papers to have it peer reviewed, you have to support the software, and you have to advertise the software and maintain it. And doing that, even for what was then a fairly humble piece of software like PEST, for $30,000 a year was a tall order. But the moment anyone has to compete with government-funded software, it has to be public domain or everyone will use the government-funded software. Now, unless that government-funded software is as good as the software that it replaces, the world loses a valuable resource. And I think our industry is paying a heavy price for the fact that the role of the private sector in producing software is not completely, but almost emasculated by the fact that anyone who writes anything new and different, with all the demands that entails, has to compete, especially with the USGS, to have that software made public and accepted. And what is the price of that? I wouldn't be surprised if the price is that we're back a generation behind where we would be as an industry if the private sector weren't so emasculated. Is this going to be recorded?
It should.
That is a big issue for me, and I think if there, who else is out there who, not just in parameter estimation but in other fields, couldn't have written software far superior and developed ideas far superior to what we're using now if we as an industry, A, didn't demand our software for nothing, and B, didn't have to compete with the government in writing it. Do you have any comments on that? You don't have to say anything on that contentious subject.
What I value in ModFlow in particular is that since it's used everywhere and it is available everywhere, it can be, understood and used by any student in the world, by any company in the world. So people have a common tool that they can use. Well, I agree with you that there may be superior tool elsewhere, but at least it's a good tool. It works. It does good work, good things, and the deficiencies which you mentioned, the fact that it prevents better software to be distributed, is in a way balanced by the universality of its use and the fact that everybody knows it. And as a teacher, if I have to teach my student to use modeling, I wouldn't hesitate to teach them ModFlow, because at least that would be understood by any company they can be hired by, and they will have at least learned how you do operate codes, and they may help them to use other codes later on, because they have the hands-on experience in one code, which is good. So, I mean, we have developed...
It's good until you want to model multi-layered aquifers with cells that dry out.
Yeah, well, it has all kinds of deficiencies. I mean, the Paris School of Mines, where I used to work before joining University Paris 6, has developed a similar type of tool, which is called NewSAM, developed by my good colleague Emmanuel Ledoux, who use square meshes that can be divided into smaller grids and so on and so forth. And it treats multi-layered aquifer in a much better way, I believe, than ModFlow. Nevertheless, nobody uses it.
Why? Because nobody gets to hear of it.
Well, initially he wanted, as you did, to get some money to support it, and
he wanted to earn a living.
Yes, I know.
Everyone has a right to earn a living.
Yes, but he was a public servant working in a public school. So of course he needed that money to hire, assistant that could help with the programming and all that. But he did sell a few, so it helped a little bit. But as you said, there is no competition. You cannot compete with the USGS and ModFlow. But again, I don't think it's bad. I mean, let me give you another example. I worked, when was it, in the late 90s, with an international commission which was called the Fairhurst Commission. And the Fairhurst Commission was to evaluate the environmental impact of the French nuclear tests in the Mururoa and Fangatofa atolls in the Pacific. And we had to do a very complex, 3D modeling of the flow of nuclides transported by density differences of seawater heated in an atoll. Clearly, ModFlow could not do that. So we used a German code, which was FIFLOW, which is excellent and does finite elements and so on. So when you have tough problems, even working in an international framework, and you need a top quality model to do things that simple codes like ModFlow cannot do, well, you can have access to it. And you know about modeling because you've learned to use some codes, and the work actually was done by a guy who works here in Neuchâtel, Pierre Perrochet, who at that time was at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, and he did the modeling using that flow code, FIFLOW, superbly. So I don't think ModFlow prevents you to use excellent codes when you really need them. So my answer to you is perhaps not what you would like me to say,
No,
but I see some benefits in having this universal code. Of course, if we could, but what you've done is to contribute to ModFlow, because in a way you're not consistent with yourself. And excuse me to tell you that, but if you don't like ModFlow because of all the good reasons you've given, in fact, by setting up PEST in the framework of ModFlow, you have given more and more attraction and more strength to ModFlow, haven't you?
That is true, and it's a fact that our industry, unlike perhaps surface water modelling, if there is a hub of the wheel in which if an idea is to gain currency, it gains currency through being used with ModFlow, immediately that idea is disseminated to the whole community. And I have to say, it wasn't so much ModFlow I was complaining about, it was USGS offerings in parameter estimation that I was complaining about.
Okay, so we
And that may be a subject for another day.
Maybe we can come back on the adoption of pilot points in PEST. When did you read first about pilot points?
Well, it became obvious to me, well, firstly, coming from a geophysical background, it became obvious to me that if we're going to use models to make real-world decisions, parameterization is everything. It's okay if we get the processes right, and let's assume for the moment that models with ModFlow, if used at an appropriate place, has the processes right, and if not, we need something more complicated. But if a model's going to be used, and it's not going to give us the right answer, but if a model's going to be used to give a range of possibilities wherein that right answer lies, then it's only going to be able to do that if it's parameterized correctly. And the more complex models are, the more parameters they need. And then there seems to be a certain inconsistency in saying I'm going to have a complex model and drape over it a simplistic parameterization scheme, and then use overdetermined methods to calibrate that model, and then say, well, if the heterogeneity cannot be uniquely estimated, it doesn't exist. After all, if we acknowledge the fact that any prediction depends on system fine detail, and you've mentioned contaminant transport, but surface water, groundwater interaction are other examples. The response of any system to extreme climatic events, CO2 sequestration. To the extent that any prediction depends on fine detail, and we're being asked more and more to make those predictions, the reason that it's going to have uncertainty associated is not, it's the stuff that falls between the cracks of the calibration process. That we can constrain the prediction to some extent, but often a limited extent through calibrating. But we need to be able to represent not just the heterogeneity which must exist to explain the data, we also need to represent the heterogeneity that may exist. So the model then, if it's going to do what I said before, to encapsulate what we know and quantify what we don't, we have to first be able to use it as a means of getting every bit of information we can out of the data. That means using parameterization devices, which we can place everywhere, and let the mathematics take care of the regularization. Let the calibration process be as responsive as possible to any information in the data, and hopefully thereby end up with a minimum variance solution, error variance solution to the inverse problem. The heterogeneity that has to exist, the detail that must exist to explain the data. And then we've only done step one of proper model usage, and that is to build on that and to constrain in doing so the heterogeneity, the detail that may exist in looking at the suite of possibilities that remain after we've used all our data to condition that suite of possibilities. Now, given that that's what I think, a model has that's the only thing it can aspire to do, a couple of things follow from that. Firstly, the model on its own, be it ModFlow, be it phi-flow, be it whatever, on its own, it's only doing half the job that it needs to do in environmental management. If we have to stand not just on one leg, which is the model, we have to stand on two. So the model has to dance with software just as complicated, that does the estimation of the parameters and that does the constraints on the parameters as uncertainty explored. So conclusion one is that phi-flow, ModFlow in the real world context is only half the story. The other half is an equally sophisticated piece of software that operates using mechanisms of highly parameterized inversion that can get the most out of data. And conclusion two is that to use models properly means that calibration is step one and that uncertainty analysis is step two, and both of those together then form the foundation for environmental decision making. So why pilot points? Well, PEST is model independent. I want to use it with any model. phi-flow today, ModFlow tomorrow. So I've constrained to calculate derivatives by finite differences. I need a parameterization scheme that's not down to the element level if I'm going to do that, but certainly not at a high level like zones, which are unrealistic and perhaps, sort of solving an overdetermined inverse problem. I don't. I want to use mathematical regularization. So pilot points is that in-between place where I can calculate derivatives using finite differences and I can use methods of highly parameterized inversion for calibration and uncertainty analysis. But as with you, this story evolved. At first, I'm happy to admit that I was obsessed with gaining the perfect fit, that I could calibrate a model better than anyone else. But it was only over time that I realized that we're not using models properly unless we follow that highly parameterized inversion followed by uncertainty analysis path, and pilot points seem to be, given the context we're working in, the optimal way to parameterize many but not all models. So that's how that. But I took my inspiration. I got the idea from you. I didn't think of pilot points myself.
Well, I didn't either, since it's Monsieur Dupuis who invented it. Yes. But I think it's nice to see how ideas, are transferred from one scientist to another, yes, and then taken over and developed and made popular, and maybe some can just die because nobody takes them down. But if I can, I would like to add a third leg to your approach of the inverse, which I fully support, and I did that I tried to do that for many years. But I think there's a third component to our problem, and data is not just enough. Let me take an example. We're trying to understand the flow in a aquifer, in a sandy aquifer, which has been deposited by, streams meandering and or which deposits, and even though you don't have any data, intuitively at least, that the type of heterogeneity that you will find in such an environment, geological environment, is already predetermined by the method in which the sediment was deposited. If it's a meandering stream or a braided stream, certainly not going to be the same structure if it is a sediment deposited under the sea. So you have to introduce that, and this is, I would say, additional information that you should have in mind in making a definition of how you're going to parameterize the value of the parameters. So this kind of thinking, I think, Philippe, you are very much along that. And I've seen pictures that you have published recently on how different geostatistical methods can understand the distribution of the delta of the Renard River. You took an aerial picture of the Renard River and you see the heterogeneity, and then you have developed the multi-point approach or the simple geostatistical approach, and you added third dimension to that because you know something more than just what the data tell you. You know so this type of thinking, I mean, has not been far enough to say anything very interesting, but led me into looking at what's called genetic modeling. It's to say, can we use that data that we know how the sediment was deposited by having a model that does that for us. So it's a preliminary model before any groundwater modeling or any inverse or anything. So we run a model which will represent the way sediments are being deposited. So the first to do that, at least in hydrogeology, is Steve Gorlick. He did that for the modeling of the Bay of San Francisco. It was superb what he did. So there are other ways to do that. We developed at the University of Paris another technique where we modeled the Rhone Valley, and we end up with distribution in space of facies of sediments, sand, gravel, clay, and that, which is consistent with the image or a modeling image that you can have of how the sediment was deposited. And then you have a value of at least the type of sediment in space in 3D. And what is totally unresolved, at least to me at this stage, is how you use that data in an inverse problem framework. Because then you have to change either the value of the parameter in each block. You assume that the facies distribution is correct. That's to say, what the genetic model gave you is a distribution of facies. Now, in each of these facies, you can say probability is 10 to the minus 2 or 10 to the minus 3 or whatever. You can fit that. But that gives too much, too much weight to the geometry of the distribution of these small elements of facies, which is probably very uncertain because of the errors or the approximation of the modeling, of the genetic modeling approach. So we have to have some kind of an inverse that would make all these things fit together. And I mean, I haven't even considered doing that.
Maybe I can comment on that. Yeah, for me, it's not a third leg. It's just that we are changing the kind of prior vision of the characterization of the heterogeneity. In the pilot points, we had this idea that there is a multi-Gaussian distribution behind the spatial distribution of the patterns of permeability or whatever. And here we have to replace this multi-Gaussian assumption by something that accounts for the structure of the sediments. And this is what we try to do with multiple point statistics. And then we end up into mathematical problems because the solutions are unstable and etc. So this is also why John is in Neuchâtel these days, because we have to talk about that. But for me, it's not a third leg, it's changing the prior, because finally we are moving to a kind of Bayesian approach of the inverse, where you have a prior distribution of possibility of the world, and in that prior domain, we try to select what are the models that are compatible with the observations. And it's more this selection process that we try to do efficiently, rather than starting from the data and calibrating a model toward the data. I think, I don't know if you would agree, but I think we are progressively changing the vision of the inverse problem in that direction.
These are delicious problems, and I think there's two ways, at least, that I'm approaching the problem, and I haven't overcome them yet, which means there may be a third or fourth way. but to use genetic type models constrained by the need for the model to replicate historical measurements of system state, especially where those genetic models involve categorical variables, is not a problem for the faint-hearted, but it's something that needs attention. That's option one, and option two is to say, well, can we, for the purposes of using the model in the real world, replace this with an appropriate surrogate continuous distribution and know the cost of surrogacy in terms of the increased penchant for error induced by using that surrogate. And if that penchant for error is A, not too much, and B, quantifiable, that may be a way to use that wisdom, is to transfer that wisdom into an appropriate continuous surrogate that we can apply calibration constrained Monte Carlo methods to. Now, I don't know which of those two approaches, or a third or fourth, is going to end up being the best, but it is, I agree, the problem facing at least the parameter estimation uncertainty analysis side of groundwater modelling. That's the problem of the day, the problem du jour.
One approach which I found very interesting is the gradual deformation method, which has been developed by Lin Hu, who is a colleague who worked at the French Institute of Petroleum. I think he's a professor somewhere.
No, he moved in the oil industry now.
No,
he is working for an oil company in Houston.
Anyway, the idea is consistent with what you two said, is that any of these, for instance, genetic models can generate several images. No? Now you have, let's take two of these images, and these are alternatives that you can use to fit the model. Now the gradual deformation approach, I'm not going to go into any of the details of the theory, is that you can deform one of the solution by an additional parameter which makes it at the end, so the parameter is goes from 0 to 1. When you are 0 you have image 1. When you go to 1 you have image 2. And in between you have a sort of a mixture or a deformation of the image. Not just a cell, but the entire image of the system into a gradual way from going to image 1 to image 1. Of course, you can put that parameter alpha into an inverse, and then you get the optimal alpha, which will be sort of a mix of two images. And then if you go on, you add a third image, which is a random generated possible solution of the genetic model, or image of the solution, and then you mix it either with the one that you have already mixed and so on and so on. So you can build several inverse by using as input images that come from another type of modeling. So I still maintain that it is a third. It's not exactly the Gaussian, multi-Gaussian definition of the variability of the parameter in space is indeed the underlying model of geostatistics and pilot points. But it's so simple. I mean, it's just Gaussian distribution and the variogram. Whereas when you say, well, we can transform that into genetic model, yes, you're right in a way, but it's a
no. I mean, we are replacing completely the multi-Gaussian by something else.
Yes, yes.
And then we enter to a lot of problems.
And there are many ways to do that, and genetic is one. But I think the future lies into.
My impression is that the future lies in the mixing of different techniques, and you cannot rely just on one.
Yes, but
we should use the process
finding. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. To finding, optimality somewhere. So and then the sensitivity studies and generation of alternatives and so on. So you are the center of the whole problem.
The center of the problem? Or I'd rather be the center of the solution. But tell me then. Tell me. This is exciting, and it's especially exciting for us because it's our love. But if, as in most places, they're still calibrating models by hand, and we can't get them to accept even basic inverse modelling as a part and parcel of everyday environmental problem solving, how are we going to change the world?
I think this is changing now.
I give you the solution. We'll have to show this interview to all the mothers of the world and have them change their mind.
Yeah, they might be bored by now.
I think we have talked too much already, but what can I say? I mean, as I liked my job of teaching in universities, hydrogeology, I think it's part of our responsibility as teachers. You're a teacher now, or part-time teacher at least, and to tell them how it is important, why we should go that way and not that, and why old people and people that are of my age are wrong by definition. I mean, they use old techniques, old techniques and old ideas, and the modern world is this gentleman important.
So, would you give that? What would your recommendation be to your successor? If if you would summarize all what you've said before, what would your key recommendation be to the next generation teachers?
Teachers.
Or professors teaching students or transmitting the knowledge to consultants?
I mean, the message for teachers, I think, is that by definition we should be aware of the latest development, of the latest techniques that have been developed, of the pros and cons of each of these things, and not just do what is easy to do, that is to say, teach the same course this year that I taught last year. So that is a responsibility of the teaching community. Be aware of the changes and teach that to the students.
I think that all environmental courses need something about data processing.
Yes.
The word inverse modelling or inverse problem, the first time that people hear that shouldn't be when they've completely finished with university. It should be in second year university, so that when I run a course and I put a matrix up on the board and people need to be re-informed what a matrix is, that problem shouldn't arise. Data processing should be part of our thinking and part of university courses. And I know there's a lot to teach in courses, but in the end it's all about data processing. Modelling is all about environmental data processing, and that concept of data processing should be part of our education more so than it is now, I think.
Yes. I think that the new term, I'm not sure it has any different meaning from what you just mentioned, but is data assimilation. Whether that has some additional thing before data processing, but
it's a bit new age. I like it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's newer. So the people, young people like you, should teach. Data assimilation. That's the thing to teach.
I believe people using that word have Kalman filters in mind and these kind of techniques. Yeah. But they are very successful. So we should also.
Nice.
We should also.
Is a very good thing.
Yeah.
Now, to try to answer your general question, what should the teachers do now? I think the major, if I were young, my major problem would be to select an area where effort should be done. What is the most, challenging area of our discipline where efforts should be put? And I don't know, I don't have the answer, but that would be the first question I would ask myself. For instance, just a sort of a counter example, I became interested in coupled processes, Onsager, physical coupled processes, the role of heat gradient in the transport of nuclides or the transport of this and that, which is fascinating. I mean, physically and chemically and modeling wide, it's very difficult. But it's a topic that is of no interest to anyone. So if you go into that and you work a long time in studying this, and you never got any papers published or any comment for anyone because it's just not a topic of interest at this time. Now it's becoming, but 20 years ago it was not. So you have to select topics in view of their scientific, technical, physical, chemical, whatever, mathematical interest, and also it has to be something that is, à la mode,
Trendy.
fashionable. Because if you do things which are really of no interest to anyone, then you can do beautiful things, but you're alone. So unless you have a very strong ego and say, I'm very good because I do the most important things and I don't care if anyone is interested or not, if you don't have that, then you should be able to join scientific interest and social interest, or societal interest.
But isn't the history of science replete with people who've done something that they know is important, and it's not cool, but it's recognised later on that it was important? If the people so I've always thought that people who want to follow their heart must be encouraged to do so, and if they don't get cited enough because of it, then it shouldn't matter.
You're certainly familiar with what's his name, Wegener. Wegener, who published in the 20s the theory of plate tectonics. Not exactly the way it's been developed 50 years later. Well, he was one of those. He had the idea much before anyone. Now, would I recommend to this young gentleman to be Wegener and to have a poor career because he was shown to be wrong by the whole scientific community? You have to be really...
well, it depends whether you want to be recognized when you're alive or have a statue built for you after you're dead.
I would prefer a little bit of both. So if I can give you an advice, of course, if you think you are Wegener and you can invent things that anybody else does not believe.
The problem is that you know that not beforehand, but after many, many years.
So you can be a little bit a small Wegener in having some ideas in the original ideas that everybody rejects. That's fine. But put your whole career in doing that. That's what I would call a Don Quixote. Don Quixote, type of career, and I mean, if your mindset is so that you want to be Don Quixote, go ahead.
But I think it's also part of human nature that when you look at the complexities of human nature, often the things within a human being that make them come up with new world-shattering ideas is a fundamental desire, maybe born of an obstinate nature, to thumb their nose at the establishment rather than run in the same direction as everybody else. And perhaps that those people who are going to have the breakthroughs are never going to have the great careers, precisely because it's the same psychology that leads to one leads to the other.
I would argue with that, because he asked me what kind of advice.
What kind of advice would you give to the next generation professors?
It's a different story, because if I tell him, well, look for this particular area where you can make a contribution which nobody has thought of, and you're going to stand by that thing, and when 100 years later you will be famous, I wouldn't do that as a recommendation. If during your career you come up with something which really you are sure about what you've found, it's objectionable for everybody else, but you know it's true, hey, go ahead and defend it. And you have to defend it because it's your own idea, because you found that as you were marching doing science. But this is different to saying, well, I am somebody exceptional, so I will find that idea myself and I will push it. So yes, if you find one, because you're doing science as everybody else, and you find something great, and you think it's right, and you want to prove and devote your whole career in doing that, that's excellent, that's science. But not start with this idea. Not start by selecting the topics you want to work on by saying, I want to be the only one to do that. That's not the criteria I would select. Do you agree?
I think we have little control over these matters. I think we'll start off doing what makes most sense at the time, which will inevitably be defined by those around us. But I think as we spend time in the industry and spend time with our colleagues, there'll be those who will naturally be tend to pursue incrementally a current set of thought. He'll be safe for the establishment, he'll get promoted through any system. And there'll be those who'll naturally find themselves a little bit on the outer, just because of who they are, and they'll possibly be the ones who'll naturally tend to have ideas which are a little bit different from mainstream, and naturally, not through any conscious choice, find themselves doing things a little differently, and perhaps a higher probability for those people to come across the idea that's going to be the defining idea of the next generation.
Yes, I fully support that. Yes, this is true. So, can you transform that into advice to our young colleagues?
We'll see in a few years.
I believe we have talked too much already, no?
That's okay. Maybe First, we have to thank you for accepting this
discussion. Thank you for
organizing
this. Thank you for discussing with the four of us.
And I think we could continue forever, for a long time.
Well, now that we've got off science and onto philosophy, we've only just begun. Yeah.